problem that we're trying to solve with blended finance is basically for the private sector to participate in investment to protect the environment. Climate change, but also land degradation, oceans, what we call the blue economy, and also biodiversity.
The public sector can invest to a certain degree, and often there's a gap in the middle, and that gap could be around risk. It could be about the appetite of the private sector to take certain time frame risks, where the investment might be 7 years or 10 years as opposed to a 5-year investment. And there's so that various gaps can need filling. And what we can do in those circumstances is saying, well, what can the private sector do and the public sector together to start to fix some of those gaps?
As an investor, we think there's a unique opportunity that people have not seen in investing against the effects of climate change, the risk and impact increased by climate change. Blended finance, working with philanthropies and governments, as well as private sector investors, is a way of starting to tackle that new problem. So by decreasing the risk or perceived risk of these investments, we can start investing in new areas of opportunity and start to prove the way that we can actually take capital and help solve the problem of climate change.
These blended finance ideas started off with people saying, this is the public sector subsidising the private sector. We've overcome that hurdle now by showing that if the private sector can have their investments de-risked, in the longer term, more money flows from the private sector and the public sector can slowly back away from making investments.
The real reason that blended finance is an important tool is because governments have a limited amount of money. They can take that money and just give it to people as a grant, or they can take that funding and use it to change the risk profile for investors so that vastly more money from the private sector will go to that effect. If I gave you just $10, you can take that $10 and do something with it. If I took that $10 and I encouraged $100 to be invested alongside of it, I've had 10 times the impact with that $10 than I had by just giving it away. And I think that's the magic of blended finance, is it persuades the other $100 from the private sector that wants to find new investments to do something that the government wants to do anyway.
Blended finance is a key tool for mobilizing and scaling up private capital in areas where private sector investment is scarce, such as land degradation, biodiversity, and fisheries.
We are basically here working in frontier areas. If you ask who is actually investing in nature, I think we are one of the very few who have been doing that since 1992.
Now we are moving towards much more difficult transition, the blended finance. It's how to manage natural resource. It's more like a forest, it's about an ocean, it's about land. Then it becomes much more challenging picture, because if you think about this those natural resource management, the major difference between carbon or energy sector and those natural resource sector is nature really doesn't have price.
New ways of thinking are required to push investments towards protecting ecosystems, species, and natural processes. Blended finance is a proven key tool for galvanizing funding and creating a track record of bankable projects in developing countries.